Go ahead and be seated. I invite you to turn in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 6. That's where we're going to be this morning. And perhaps the greatest challenge in looking at this text this morning is the challenge of familiarity. If you've grown up in the church, or even if you haven't, odds are that this is a very familiar text. I forgot to plug in the computer, so if you just want to plug in that white cord there into the side of the iMac, it'll go. At any rate, even as small children, this is maybe one of the first Bible stories that kids hear. It's Daniel and the lion's den, and it's a challenge because it's one of the most popular, one of the most familiar Old Testament stories, and so we look at it and we can have a tendency to think, yeah, I know that story. Yeah, Daniel and the lion's den. Got it. And we often read this story, and in reading this story, the point of the story becomes be like Daniel. And I don't think that that's fully capturing what the Bible is getting at all. And we need to ask a couple of questions. Number one, what made Daniel the kind of person he was? And what was God doing through him? So if you read chapter 5 of Daniel, what you'll see is that Darius took over the kingdom, and this is the third king that Daniel has served in his tenure in exile. He was taken from his home as a young boy into the Babylonian Empire. He served 3 different kings, 3 different regimes, Nebuchadnezzar's son, and now Darius, the Medes and the Persians, have come and taken over the empire. And we find in the opening verses of Daniel chapter 6 how this new king approaches the rule of his kingdom. He wants to make sure that all of the revenue is coming to him that should be coming to him. He wants to make sure that everything is happening on the up and up so that he gets all of the things that he's supposed to have in his kingdom. And so he constructs this system where there are 120 satraps throughout the kingdom, and all of them are overseen by 3 high officials, and Daniel was one of those 3 high officials. And we see very quickly that these 3 receive an account from the satraps, and the king suffers no loss. And in verse 3, we see that Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. And that's the lead up to this passage and this conundrum. So I don't know what's happening with that. You can just turn it off. That's fine. So the first thing we want to see this morning is Daniel's character, okay? First thing we want to see is Daniel's character. We see the character of Daniel very clearly in not only this chapter, but the previous 5 chapters. We're introduced to Daniel, and what do we see about him? He refuses to eat the foods of the Persians because he is a devoted Jew who would not abandon God's dietary laws even though he was in exile. And it has been many years since he was ripped away from his home and taken into exile. And during all that time, he has lived in a pagan culture. And now we see him at about 70 years old, and he is still remaining faithful. He still has this exceptional character that has been a hallmark of his life from the very first time we're introduced to him. His loyalty to the kingdom is not in question. He is absolutely consistent over time. He served Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and now he serves Darius. In other words, Daniel didn't compromise over time. Think about that. Being in exile for 70 years, how many temptations would there be to just assimilate and compromise and become just a little bit more like the culture, because it's just kind of hard to maintain that character and those standards in a culture that doesn't value those same things. He didn't coast on his past success. He didn't let his guard down. He didn't assimilate to the dominant tactics of the culture. He remained committed to godly character in his life and interactions. It's interesting that the qualifications for elders are mostly character qualifications. When you look at 1 Timothy chapter 3 and in Titus chapter 3, what you don't see is a lot of things that the world would maybe value when it comes to elders and pastors. What you see are a lot of character qualifications. Because the character of the person matters. Because character reflects values. Character is an indicator of the God that we serve. God's character incarnated into us should be seen through us. And Daniel serves as a great example of that. We are to reflect God's character in our lives. That means we're consistent. We don't shift when it's to our advantage to do so. It's difficult to continue with this as we age, though, isn't it? Because there are increasing temptations to just make a little compromise here, a little compromise here. No one's going to really notice. And what we see with Daniel is that his character was so impeccable that that's the reason he got into trouble. You don't hear that in the kindergarten version. Daniel went to the lion's den because people hated him because he reflected God's character unrelentingly, uncompromisingly. Daniel reflected God's character in his life, and that's what we're meant to do as God's people. And it can be difficult as we get older. It can be difficult as the complexities of life grow and things are not as cut and dry and black and white and easy as they were when we were 10 or 15 or 25. Isn't it interesting how life gets more complex the older you get? Like the things that you think are just like real cut and dry are still cut and dry, but it's just really hard to apply that cut and dryness because there's bigger consequences. Or you don't maybe have somebody backing you up, or you don't have your parents right there behind you. And Daniel's character made him stand out. We see that in verse 3. Then Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. He was distinguished among his peers. Daniel's character set him apart from the rest of the court. And this led to them wanting to take him down. Look at verses 4 and 5. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Now, why did the other officials want to take him down? That's a question worth pondering for a moment. Could it be that we know this, right? The higher up you get in government, the more corruption there is. And so you've got 120 dudes that are set over bringing in the revenue. And you got 3 guys that are set over making sure those 120 dudes are doing what they're supposed to do. And then you have Daniel, who's put in charge of this whole thing to make sure that everything's on the up and up. And Daniel is going to make sure that everything is on the up and up, which means that you skimming from the top, not going to happen under Daniel. If you want to maybe get ahead a little bit and have him cut a corner, he's not going to do it. If you did something wrong and you go and you try to bribe him to keep it from the king, not going to happen. Daniel's character was so impeccable that the other people around him wanted to undo him because he was unassailable. That is insane. A person who has been in leadership at the top of the empire under 3 emperors still has an unassailable character. You elect somebody to go to Congress 3 weeks later, you can't trust them. This guy was steady. He was unwavering. He was unmoving. And this excellent quality was not something that was shown overnight. It was a constant quality of character that stood out over time. It outlived regime changes. It showed through the service of 3 kings. So for most men, power corrupts, but for Daniel seems to be beyond the reach of corruption, never taking a bribe, never cutting a corner. There was nothing that they could levy against him, no charge that they could levy against him that would stick. Incidentally, that's what it means to be above reproach when it comes to being an elder, that there's nothing that'll stick. And this was shown over 70 years, and that's why he stood out. He was a man of stability in an unstable world, a man of conviction in a world that lacks any conviction, a pure man in a dirty world, a man of integrity in a world that is shady. In other words, this is who he was no matter what situation he was in, no matter what king was in control, whether he was a great man in the kingdom or not, whether he was at home or whether he was at work. And that's what our character is. Our character is who we really are. Who we are in front of people and in private. And there's to be a consistency there that makes our character unassailable because it's reflecting God's character. He was also a man of conviction. He was not willing to compromise his integrity. He was unswerving in his conviction, and conviction is a mark of character. We look around and we see like the evangelifish that have no spine and are blown around from one thing to another, can't maintain character because character is deeply rooted in conviction. And those convictions are derived from the Word of God. So people of character and integrity will be people of conviction, and they will stand up for their convictions. And so he continues to do this thing where he goes and he prays 3 times a day. And here's the really interesting thing. I couldn't find anywhere, if I'm wrong, correct me, but I couldn't find anywhere where the Israelites in exile were commanded to pray 3 times a day. I found a psalm where it seems that the psalmist's pattern was to do that, but it was not a command. And yet, Daniel had a conviction that for him, it was good and pleasing to God to pray 3 times a day. He was unwilling to compromise that conviction. He was a man of conviction. And so the final thing we need to see about his character then is that his character did not make his life easy. And it was consistent in adversity. You want to see the character of a person? Run them through the ringer. Bring charges against them. See how they handle that. Character is shown in adversity, and consistent character is shown to be consistent through adversity. And Daniel's character did not make his life easy. It wasn't a primrose path. He made enemies. Because of his character, people hated him. Because of his character, people were jealous. Because of his character, people wanted to get rid of him. So there's this show that we really like in our home. It's called Blue Bloods. It's a show about a cop family in New York City. It stars Tom Selleck, and I might or might not be a little bit envious of his mustache. It's the only mustache I've ever seen that looks any good at all, except for Ron's. It's not really a mustache. It's kind of like a happy trail that goes all the way up to the... Anyway, one of the things I love about Frank Reagan is he is completely incorruptible in a corrupt system. This guy will always do what's right all the time. He will not cut corners. He will not shave loyalties. He will not make deals behind closed doors. He is the type of guy that is able to thrive in a corrupt system because he is incorruptible. And he just does things above the board. And whenever that happens, enemies come and plots are hatched. And so we see with Daniel, there's a plot in verses 5 through 9. What we see is that these officials come to the king and they know, look at verse 5, look at verse 7. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, all agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes a petition to any god or any man for 30 days, except for you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. The first thing is, they're kind of being shady about this already, right? I mean, isn't Daniel one of the officials? I don't think Daniel signed off on this. They all got together behind Daniel's back, and they brought this to the king in a group of people and said, hey, we all agree on this. All the officials agree on this. Well, it's not really true because Daniel probably wasn't on board with this. I don't think Daniel would have signed off on this. Because it also says that when he learned about this in verse 10, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, so the first thing we see is that they're even shady in going to the king, and they're doing this for a reason. Look at verse 5. The officials knew that Daniel's allegiance was to God, and that was paramount to him. In verse 5, then these men said, we shall not find any ground for complaint against Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. There it is. Completely unassailable character. Totally above the board. And they knew that the only way they were going to be able to get this guy is if they somehow pitted Darius as God against God, Yahweh as God. As if somehow they made him choose between allegiance to the king or allegiance to the King of Kings. They knew that was the only way they were going to get him. They wouldn't be able to get him unless they can somehow make it illegal for him to follow the law of God. See, they understood something about Daniel. They understood that he had a hierarchy of authority and that God's law was under the king's law was under God's commands. So in a crafty plot, they figured, here's how we'll get rid of him. We'll have a law made that says that nobody can pray to anyone except for the king for 30 days. That's a reasonable amount of time. We can survive 30 days, and it's enough to trap him. And then when he messes up and when he goes to his God in prayer, which we know he's going to do, then we got him. Then we get rid of him. He won't compromise there. See, they knew his character. They knew how he stood out, and they used his character in the plot because they knew there were certain things he wouldn't compromise on. They knew who his ultimate allegiance was to. And this brings up, I think, an important and culturally relevant question. Where do you stand when the state demands that you disobey God? So we'll see in a moment why Daniel had this kind of character. Okay, so we'll come to how this is formed in us in a minute, but I just want to stop and pause and ask this because the Equality Act, if that passes, will strip religious protection from opposing homosexual and tranny agendas. What will you do when they demand that you acknowledge that the state is Lord over sexuality and not God? The state of Nebraska Department of Education just released proposed health standards that are including teaching sexual fluidity and multiple genders and all of the rest of this nonsense. So where do you as a parent or a teacher land if that passes and if it's adopted by your school district? Just yesterday, Arthur Pawlowski was arrested by Calgary police for failing to comply with illegal demands and holding a church service. Same thing happened to James Coates. So Psalm 2 is really helpful in this because I think we see Psalm 2 not only in our culture, but in this story of Daniel. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and the Lord's anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs, and the Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry with you, and you perish in the way of his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are those who take refuge in him. In other words, Jesus is Lord of all. Daniel recognized that. Daniel recognized that God's authority superseded the authority of Darius. He recognized that you cannot bow to Darius and bow to God as Lord. You cannot say Christ is Lord, in other words, and say, I'll bow to Caesar. And you can't say Christ is Lord. I'm not going to bow to Caesar on a bunch of big issues if I've already bowed to Caesar on a bunch of little issues that aren't his to bow to. So in the first century, the Roman Empire had no problems with Christians worshiping God as God, as long as Christians burned incense to Caesar. I mean, it's such a little thing. Why not? Why not just burn a little bit of incense to Caesar in your house every day? It's not like you mean it. It's such a little thing. It doesn't really mean anything. I can make that compromise. It's just to get along, and everything will be fine. But the early Christians weren't willing to do that. They didn't do it because they really believed that Jesus is Lord of all. And that claim is Christ supplanting the claim that Caesar made. Caesar made the claim to be Lord of all. And Christians said, no, Jesus is. And they were not willing and did not have the authority to blaspheme Christ by worshiping Caesar, even if it was incense that they didn't even mean for anything. They just did it to get along. They were unwilling to do it. Their character wouldn't let them. And so many went to their deaths for the simple act of refusing to burn incense to Caesar. And we live in a pluralist society, and pluralists are totally fine with pluralists. What they're not fine with is exclusivists. Ones that say Jesus is the only way. Jesus is the only Lord. Jesus lays claim over every realm of life. Pluralists can't handle that. And they hate Christianity because it's exclusive. And so we need to wrestle with this. Because this is not like a far-fetched idea. This is not something that your grandparents would look at and be like, yeah, that's not going to happen here, right? We can see it. It's coming. Where do you stand? The plot was hatched the way it was because Daniel was fiercely committed to God. He was fiercely committed to obedience to God, to God's claim of absolute authority over every aspect of his life. And all I'm saying is that we should examine ourselves and ask am I submitting to Christ as Lord in every aspect of my life? What are the areas of my life where I try to hold dual allegiance? Am I walking the line, or am I firmly planted on God's side? So they find him praying in violation of this command, and we kind of all know how this pans out. They go to the king, and they bring this to the king, and they say, hey, remember when you said that thing, that you can't pray to anybody else? It's according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, so it's irreversible, right? You're still on board with that? Yeah. Okay, well, Daniel just did it. And the king is distressed because he likes Daniel. I mean, Daniel's a good guy. Daniel's got this kind of character that you want as a king, as your chief official. And so he spends the whole night trying to figure out a way around this. Can't figure out any way around it. And so we all know the story. He puts Daniel in the lion's den. Now, what I want to do is I want to look right now at the keys to Daniel's character that I think we find clues in this text. Because if we want to have that type of character, and I think we all should, if we want to have that type of fierce commitment, where does it come from? How is it forged in us? How is it produced in us? Look what happens in verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to the house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before God as he had done previously. He goes upstairs. This is Daniel's response to this edict. He goes upstairs and he prays. So there's 3 things that I think that we see about Daniel that produce this kind of unbeatable attitude. It's prayer, God-centeredness, and faith. So the first thing we see is his prayer life. His prayer life in verses 10 through 11. In verse 11, he says, these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before God. He just kept doing what he'd always been doing. He didn't change it. Now, it would have been easy for him to say, you know what, I'll just close my windows. Let's do this privately for 30 days. I can't say that there would necessarily be anything wrong with that. But he didn't. He also didn't, he didn't hear about the decree and say, well, I'll show them. Can't stop me from praying. I'm going to pray with my window open now and show them. So he didn't have an empty or absent prayer life before and decide to take up prayer and protest. He just continued with his normal pattern. He continued to live under his convictions, and one of his convictions was, I am a man of prayer. And prayer is one of the keys to Daniel's character. Notice what characterized his prayers. Thankfulness. Daniel was a thankful man, even in the midst of exile, and knowing that he could be punished for his disobedience to the king. He continued to be thankful. Daniel was a great man in the kingdom. And the only way that he was going to remain above reproach, above the board, incorruptible, is by being great on his knees before God. The only way his character could remain unstained is by presenting himself to his God and approaching him in prayer regularly. Mary, Queen of Scots, said of John Knox, I would rather face all the armies of England than the prayers of John Knox. Great men of character, have always been men who were great in prayer. Prayer strengthens us. Prayer humbles us. Prayer emboldens us. Prayer gives us wisdom. Prayer reminds us that we're dependent. Prayer reminds us that we're not on our own. Prayer reminds us that we have access to God and He is powerful and able to work through us. Charles Spurgeon said this about this text in Daniel. How few of us fully appreciate and fondly cultivate that communion with God to which secret prayer, continuously, earnestly offered, is the key and the clue. Could we not, all of us, devote more time to seeking the Lord in the stillness of the closet greatly to our advantage? Have not all of us who have tried it found an ample recompense? Should we not be stronger and better men if we were more upon our knees? As to those of you who never seek the eternal King, how can you expect to find him? How can you look for a blessing when you never ask for it? How can you hope that God will save you when the blessings he does give you, you never thank him for, but receive them with cold ingratitude, casting his word behind your backs? Oh, for Daniel's prayerful spirit. The first key to Daniel's character is he was a man of prayer. The second one is he was God-centered. We see that in verse 16 and then again in verse 20. When the king puts him into the lion's den, he says in verse 16, then the king commanded that Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve, continually deliver you. And then look at verse 20. When he goes the next morning, as he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Did you catch that? Whom you serve continually. There was a God-centeredness to Daniel's life. He viewed all of his life as centering around God and service to God. Worship is service to God. When we serve God, when we offer ourselves, when we are willing to take every aspect of our lives and lay them in submission to the will of God where he can do what he will with them, that is worship. And Daniel was a man of worship. He was a God-centered man who continuously kept his life oriented around service to God, which means that every decision that he made, everything that he did, every interaction that he had was permeated with this idea that I am not living for myself, I am living for God. Every interaction that he had was in service to God. His service to the king was in service to God. Colossians 1:18 says of Christ, he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. God-centeredness demands more than just seeing what the text says about God. and not reading ourselves into it. God-centeredness demands that God is the gravity around which our entire lives revolve. Christ alone for a believer is to occupy the place of supremacy. As one pastor put it, all of Christ for all of life. Whereas another one put it, it's having a passion for the supremacy of Christ in all things for the joy of all peoples. Being God-centered allowed Daniel to tell the previous king the bad news that was written on the wall without putting some sugar on it to make it a little bit more digestible. God-centeredness was the ballast in his boat that kept him on course in a world of thieves and cheats and shysters. Being God-centered means that our lives are lived before the face of God, that Christ dwells in us by faith, that our allegiance is firmly fixed to Christ, and therefore anything he demands, we are willing to do. And Christ does make demands on his people. Not being God-centered, in other words, is not serving God continuously, and that leads to compromise. So Daniel had a holy habit of prayer, and he was also God-centered, but there's a third thing. Daniel was a man of faith. In this account, there's no word of him resisting when he's being thrown into this lion's den. It's kind of like Isaac, right? Remember when Abraham takes Isaac up the hill, and he's like, where's the sacrifice, Dad? He's like, God will provide. And at some point up the hill, once they get to the top, as his dad's binding his hands. I mean, this is a healthy young man, and his dad's clearly old, right? He could have taken him out. I mean, what are you tying up my hands for, man? What's a knife? He went willingly because he entrusted himself to God. Christ willingly went to the cross because he entrusted himself to the one that was able to raise him from the dead. And Daniel willingly walked into the lion's den because he entrusted himself to God. And he didn't know the outcome. Like, the familiarity of this story loses some of the tension, because you all know how it turns out, right? The Lord sent angels, and angels shut the mouths of the lions, and Daniel emerged unharmed, and everybody was happy. He didn't know that going in. For all he knew, he would go into the pit, the rock would be rolled over the top, and he would be savagely torn apart by lions and die right then and there. And yet he continuously entrusted himself to God, even though he did not know the outcome. Notice what it says in verses 21 and 22. Then Daniel said to the king, this is when the king comes and is like, hey, you still alive, man? Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent angels and shut the lions' mouths. They have not harmed me because I was found blameless before him. Here's the question. How are you found blameless before God? That's a really important question, isn't it? You think Daniel never sinned? No, he did. Even though he's like one of the most impeccable characters in the Old Testament. I mean, really, it's hard to find fault with him. We know that he sinned, right? Because everyone has sinned and falls short of the glory of God. So how can he be claiming to be found innocent before God? Think back to Romans. We're justified, declared righteous, declared innocent by faith. And the same thing was true of the Old Testament saints. Daniel trusted God, and that was the basis for his innocence before God. He was declared righteous by faith. Daniel could confidently go because he knew that whatever happened, he was blameless. And he trusted that if he died, he would be with God because of his faith. He trusted that God was powerful to save him, and whether that was a physical salvation or an eternal salvation, either way was fine with him. And so he willingly went in. Daniel's faith also enabled him to remain committed to God in the midst of a culture that demanded he bow his knee to Darius or whatever other king as ultimate. It was faith that caused Daniel to ask for kosher food when he first arrived in Babylon. It was faith that caused him to continue in his practice of prayer. It was faith that enabled him to stand against unjust demands that conflicted with God's word. So prayer and God-centeredness and faith are, you can't divorce those from character. Daniel's character was what it was because he was a man of prayer, because he was a God-centered man, and because he was a man of faith. And you can have superficial good character without that, but the only way you have true godly character is by trusting in the God who is good and just and holy and righteous, by focusing on the God who is just and holy and good and righteous, and by depending upon the God and communing with the God who is just and holy and righteous and good. God incarnates his character in us. He forms his character in us as we pray, as we focus on him, and as we exercise faith. Daniel's faith was tested throughout his life. In 1 Peter 1, verses 6 to 7, it says, "In this you rejoice, though now for a little while it is necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in the praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." Your faith is tested. And it's tested so it might grow and be shown to be genuine. What does James say? Show me your faith, I'll show you works. Because faith acts. And when the test comes, because it will come, remember that it's his power that is shown in our weakness, that it's his strength that we are trusting in. And even though we don't know the outcome, we have precious promises that we cling to by faith. True faith delivers us. Maybe not from immediate temporal peril, but ultimately, we know the Lord will receive us and welcome us into his presence. So what does this mean for us? Application. Number one, the story of Daniel is an encouragement for exiles. In 1 Peter, we're called elect exiles. This is not our home. We're temporary dwellers here. We've been transferred from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light. We now tarry here for a while, and our ultimate destination is our true home, right? The last battle says, it's like everything else was just a shadow of the real thing. This is the shadowlands that we're in now. And we go to the real thing someday. So Daniel is written so that we might be encouraged in how to live in the shadowlands. Like Daniel, we should work for the good of our neighbors and use our influence for good. But ultimately, our hope isn't here. We're passing through on the way to our eternal home. Therefore, to live as elect exiles means there will be times when the laws of men and tyrannical governments are in conflict with God's commands, and in those cases, God wins because we belong to him and we're not set here. This isn't our reality. This isn't our home. The story of Daniel is there in part to encourage those who, like Daniel, are confronted with an opposition of a secular world and remain true to God and his word and his commands. God's faithful to his people. Always faithful to his people. So live as a good exile. Don't get too tied up in this world. Don't get too attached. Secondly, trust God. Daniel's trust in God was not in vain, and neither is yours. Now, we can't make the outcome of Daniel normative, right? So like if for some reason there's some sort of weird Nazi thing, right? So like you know how it works in the ethics things. You know, would you hide a Jew knowing that you might get killed in Nazi Germany? So let's say you live there and you do that, and they find out and they put you before a firing squad. The normative thing that's going to happen is when they fire, you're going to die. Okay, what's not normative is what happened to Daniel. That's extraordinary. So it might not end well for you here in this world. If you look at Hebrews 11, the Faith Hall of Fame, it's like, there were foreign armies to flight and shut the mouths of lions and gave back their dead, and then some were sawn in half. Some were torn apart. Some wandered and were homeless and had no possessions, right? Like, we can't make this normative. But what we can see is that even whether Daniel lives or whether Daniel dies, Daniel trusts God, and that's what we need to do. We can trust God with our situation. And what we find is that God had a purpose in this. And we read about that in Daniel chapter 9 and in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. But the result of Daniel's trust in God was that God worked in the heart of the king Darius, and he actually sent the Jews back to Jerusalem and allowed them to rebuild the temple. So Nehemiah and Ezra and all of that is from Darius. And what do we see at the end of this chapter? At the end of chapter 6, he goes, Daniel's found alive, and what does he say? Verse 25, Darius wrote to all the people, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that all of my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. God had a purpose in saving Daniel, and that purpose was to bring Darius to a point of submission, to recognize that God was Lord over everything, and that led to him putting his people back in Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple just as he had promised would happen after 70 years of exile. And if God had not saved Daniel, there would have been another purpose behind that. So you can trust God. Third thing is God is working through us to expand and show his glory. If you've ever read the Fox's Book of Martyrs, there's one story in there in particular, some Roman guards who were believers, and the general put them in the water, freezing cold water, and told them that they had to stay there until they recanted. And they stood there and they sang hymns. One guy recanted. And what amazed the general was that when that one guy recanted and was pulled out, 4 others came in and took their place. Even if it doesn't go well for you, God is still working through you. Even if it ends in your death, God is still working through you. God has purposes in us exercising our faith that we cannot see and cannot comprehend, and will probably never know until we're on the other side of heaven and see all of the things for what they are. The last thing is this: Daniel points to Jesus. I'm just going to run through these real quick. High-ranking officials plotted against him to kill him. He was innocent of any wrongdoing before God. Daniel's enemies couldn't trap him or make any charge stick against him. He was found guilty of transgressing the law of Medes and the Persians. Jesus transgressed the law of the Jews. You can read about that in John 19, verse 7. Darius tried unsuccessfully to intervene for Daniel like Pilate tried for Christ. Daniel trusted God. Jesus said, "Not my will, but yours be done." Daniel descended into the pit, into the earth. Jesus went into the tomb. The den was covered with a stone and sealed. Daniel was found alive the next morning. Jesus rose on Easter morning. Daniel was raised from certain death only to die later. Jesus was raised never to die again. Daniel provided hope for exiles of his day. Jesus provides everlasting hope for exiles today. God is the living God who is able to deliver from death those that trust in him. Let's pray.